I wouldn't touch him even if he begged. That was the exact sentence that ruined my entire day, my appetite, and possibly my dignity for the next 5 to 7 business days. I didn't even mean to hear it. I was just standing there, minding my own business, holding a stupid iced coffee that cost me $6 and tasted like regret, when his voice cut through the noise like it always did. Calm, sharp, impossible to ignore. Ethan Blake didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. People leaned in when he spoke. They always had. I turned my head before I could stop myself, like my body had some kind of traitorous reflex where Ethan was concerned. Big mistake. Huge. Because there he was, standing in the middle of the courtyard like he owned the place. Which, honestly, he kind of did, surrounded by people who looked way too interested in whatever he had to say. And then he said it again, slower this time, like he was clarifying for anyone who might have missed it. Trust me, he added, with that faint, almost bored smirk. I wouldn't touch Noah Carter. Not even to prove a point. My name. He said my name. I swear the entire world just paused. Not dramatically. Not in some cinematic slow-motion way. More like everything tilted slightly off balance. Like when you miss a step going downstairs and your stomach drops for half a second. That was me. Just standing there. Holding my overpriced iced disappointment. Realizing I had just become the punchline of a conversation I wasn't even supposed to be part of. I could feel it before I even looked. Those subtle shifts. The way people's shoulders angled. The way conversations dipped just enough to make room for curiosity. No one laughed out loud. That would have been easier. This was worse. This was quiet. This was people pretending they didn't hear while very obviously hearing everything. I stared at him. He didn't look at me. Of course he didn't. Ethan never looked at me first. It was like some unspoken rule between us. Or maybe just his rule. I don't know. All I know is that we've been doing this for years. This thing. This rivalry. This constant, low-grade war made of sarcasm, competition, and the occasional academic destruction. Same classes. Same internships. Same stupid need to outdo each other at everything. He was always just slightly ahead. Just enough to be infuriating. And me? I was always just close enough to matter. Close enough to be noticed. Apparently, close enough to be insulted in public. I should have walked away. That would have been the mature thing to do. The emotionally stable, well-adjusted response. Unfortunately, I am none of those things. My feet were already moving before my brain caught up. 1 step. 2. 3. Straight toward him. My heart was doing something aggressive in my chest. Like it had suddenly decided we were in a sprint instead of a social situation. He noticed me when I was about 5 feet away. Of course he did. Ethan noticed everything. His eyes flicked up, cool and unreadable, like I was just another minor inconvenience interrupting his day. That look alone should have stopped me. It didn't. Say it again, I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt, which was honestly impressive considering my internal state was somewhere between rage and complete system failure. A few heads turned. Great. Audience secured. Ethan tilted his head slightly, like he was considering whether I was worth the effort. I don't repeat myself, he said calmly. Of course he didn't. That would be too easy. I took another step closer, close enough now that I could see the tiny shift in his expression, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. Then let me make it simple for you. I shot back, folding my arms like that might somehow hold me together. You wouldn't dare. The words hung there between us, sharp and reckless. I didn't even know exactly what I was daring him to do. I just knew I needed to push back. Needed to take something, anything, back from that moment. For the first time since I walked up, Ethan actually focused on me. Not a glance. Not a passing look. Focused. And something in his gaze changed. Just slightly. Just enough to make my stomach drop all over again. You think I wouldn't? He asked, his voice lower now, quieter, but somehow more dangerous because of it. I should have backed down. I really should have. Instead, I held his gaze and said the dumbest, most irreversible thing I could have possibly said in that moment. No. I replied, my throat suddenly dry but my voice still stubborn. I don't think you would. For a second, he did not move, and that was the worst part, because it gave my brain just enough time to catch up and start screaming at me that I had made a catastrophic mistake, a career-ending, dignity-destroying, why I'm like this level mistake, and yet I still stood there, locked in place, staring at him like I had not just challenged the most controlled, most annoyingly composed person on campus to do something reckless in front of an audience that was now very clearly paying attention. Then he exhaled, slow and almost amused, and I saw it, that tiny shift again. The one that never happened unless something had already gone very, very off script, and before I could analyze it, before I could take it back, before I could even blink properly. He stepped closer, not fast, not dramatic, just one deliberate step that erased the comfortable distance I had been relying on, and suddenly he was there, too close. Close enough that I could see the faint crease between his brows, close enough that I could hear the quiet inhale he took, like he was making a decision he had already made 10 steps ago. My brain stalled, completely and utterly stalled, because this was not how this was supposed to go. This was supposed to be a verbal sparring match, a sharp exchange, maybe a sarcastic victory if I was lucky. Not whatever this was, not the way my pulse suddenly felt like it had been hijacked, not the way my body forgot how to execute basic functions like breathing in a normal, non-suspicious way. "Careful, Carter," he said, low enough that it should have been private, except the silence around us had stretched thin, fragile, like everyone was pretending not to listen while absolutely listening. "You are making assumptions again." And I should have rolled my eyes. I should have snapped back. I should have done literally anything consistent with the personality I had spent years building specifically to survive interactions with him. But instead I just stood there, hyper-aware of everything, the space between us. The way his gaze did not waver, the way my hands suddenly felt like they did not belong to me. "Prove me wrong," I heard myself say, and I immediately wanted to revoke my own speaking privileges. Because what kind of sentence was that? What kind of reckless, open-ended invitation was that? And why did it sound like I was daring him to cross a line that I did not even fully understand? His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite anything safe. And then everything happened at once and not at all. Because 1 second he was standing there, still, composed, and the next his hand was on my wrist, firm but not rough, grounding and impossible to ignore, and he pulled me forward just enough to break whatever fragile illusion of control I had left, and my brain went completely, spectacularly blank, like someone had unplugged it mid-sentence. Because this was not happening. This could not be happening. This was Ethan Blake, the same Ethan Blake who had just publicly declared he would not touch me, and now he was very clearly about to do exactly that. Time did not slow down in a cinematic way. It fractured, it skipped, it lost its rhythm entirely, and all I could register was the sudden closeness, the way the world narrowed to a single, impossible moment. And then he kissed me, not aggressively, not carelessly, just there, deliberate and undeniable and absolutely real, and every single thought I had ever had about him, every argument, every insult, every eye roll, every moment of competition collapsed into something unrecognizable, something that did not fit into any category my brain had prepared for, and I froze, completely, because what was I supposed to do with that? What was I supposed to do with him? With this? With the fact that the one thing I had built my entire understanding of him around had just been proven wrong in the most public, most undeniable way possible. It lasted a second, maybe less, maybe more, I could not tell, and then he pulled back just enough, his hand still around my wrist, his expression unreadable except for that same faint, dangerous shift, and the silence that followed was louder than anything I had ever experienced, because now there was no pretending, no ignoring, no brushing it off as just another argument, because he had proven his point, and in the process, completely ruined mine. No one moved, and that was somehow worse than the kiss itself, because silence has a way of stretching into something unbearable when too many people are pretending not to react, and I could feel it pressing in from every direction, the weight of a dozen unspoken thoughts hanging in the air like static, waiting for someone to break it. My brain, however, had completely abandoned me, like it took one look at the situation and decided this was above its pay grade. So all I could do was stand there, wrist still caught in his hand, staring at him like I had just forgotten how reality worked, which, to be fair, I probably had, because none of this made sense, not the kiss, not the fact that it actually happened, and definitely not the way my heart was still racing like it had. Not gotten the memo that this was supposed to be a 1-second, meaningless act. Ethan, on the other hand, looked exactly the same, which was deeply offensive, because how was he so composed right now? How was he standing there like he had not just detonated a social bomb in the middle of campus? Like this was just another Tuesday, and not the moment that was about to follow me for the rest of my natural life. His thumb shifted slightly against my wrist, a small movement, barely noticeable, but it snapped something in me back into place, just enough for my brain to reboot in the most chaotic way possible, because suddenly all the thoughts came rushing back at once, loud and overlapping and deeply unhelpful, and the only thing I managed to say was, "What?" Which was not even a proper sentence, just a word, a very weak, very insufficient word for a situation that required significantly more processing power than I currently possessed. A few people nearby let out quiet, nervous laughs, like they were not sure if they were allowed to react, and I wanted to disappear immediately, preferably into another dimension where this had not just happened. But unfortunately I was still here, still standing 5 feet from the most infuriating person I had ever met, who had just casually rewritten the entire narrative of our rivalry with one single, completely unnecessary action. Ethan finally let go of my wrist, and the absence of that contact was immediate and noticeable in a way that made absolutely no sense, like my body had registered it as something important without asking for my permission, and I hated that. I hated that more than anything else in this moment, because it meant this was not as simple as I wanted it to be. "You said I would not," he replied, his voice calm, even like he was explaining a basic concept, like this was just logic, just cause and effect, and not the most unhinged escalation of an argument I had ever experienced. I stared at him, because that was his explanation, that was all I was getting, a single, completely rational sentence to justify something that felt anything but rational. And I opened my mouth to respond, to say something sharp, something that would restore the balance, but nothing came out, because what exactly was the appropriate comeback to that? What exactly was the correct response to someone proving a point in the most effective and personally destabilizing way possible? That does not count. I finally managed, which was a terrible argument, weak and unconvincing even to my own ears, but it was the only thing I had, and I clung to it like it might somehow salvage my pride. His gaze flickered, just for a second, something unreadable passing through it before. It settled back into that same composed mask, and for a moment I thought I imagined it. But then he stepped back, creating space again, restoring the physical distance that had been missing, and it should have felt like relief. It should have made everything easier, but it did not, because now I was aware of the absence, aware of the difference, and that was somehow worse. "It counted," he said simply, and then, as if that was the end of it, as if he had not just upended everything, he turned. Slightly, attention already shifting away from me, like he was done, like this was over, and that, more than anything, snapped something in my chest, because no, absolutely not, he did not get to just walk away from this like it was nothing. He did not get to drop a moment like that into my life and then act like it did not matter. "Ethan," I said, sharper now, louder, enough to stop him mid-step, enough to pull his attention back to me. And when he looked at me again, really looked this time, I felt it, that same shift, that same tension that had been building since the moment I walked up to him. And suddenly this did not feel like a finished argument. It felt like the beginning of something much worse, something I was not prepared for, and definitely not in control of anymore. He stopped, and the way he stopped was controlled, precise, like he had already anticipated I would call his name. Like this was just another move in a game he had been playing 3 steps ahead of me for years, and that realization alone made my chest tighten in a way I did not appreciate. Because I refused to believe I was that predictable. I refused to believe he knew me well enough to expect this, to expect me. Slowly, he turned back, not fully, just enough to look over his shoulder at first, like he was giving me one last chance to say something worth his time, and that tiny, almost dismissive gesture lit something sharp and reckless in me. Because no, absolutely not. I was not going to be reduced to an afterthought in a moment that he created. I took a step forward, closing the distance again, not as close as before, but close enough to make it clear I was not done, not even close. And this time when he faced me fully, there was no audience laughter, no whispering, just that same heavy silence, thicker now, more aware, like everyone sensed that whatever came next was not going to be easily brushed off. "You do not get to just walk away," I said, my voice steadier now, sharper, like I had finally found a thread of control to hold on to. Even if it was fraying at the edges, you do not get to act like that was nothing. And there it was, the first honest thing I had said since this started. Because that was the problem. That was the part my brain kept circling back to. The way he acted like it meant nothing, like it was just a point proven and nothing more. And I hated that. I hated that more than the kiss itself, because it implied something I was not ready to define. Ethan watched me for a second, really watched me. And there was something different in his expression now, something quieter, more focused, like he was recalibrating, adjusting to a version of me that was not following the usual script, and it made the air between us feel tighter, like we had both stepped into something neither of us had planned for. It was nothing, he said, and the words landed wrong, too flat, too clean, like they had been chosen deliberately to close the conversation, to shut it down before it could go anywhere inconvenient. And that should have worked. It should have been enough to end it. But instead it did the opposite, because I felt it, immediate and sharp, that instinctive rejection of his answer, like my brain was refusing to file it away as truth. No, I said, before I could stop myself. And that one word carried more weight than anything else I had said so far, because it was not sarcastic, it was not defensive, it was just certain, and I saw it again, that flicker in his eyes, that split-second crack in the control he wore so well, and suddenly I knew I had hit something real, something he did not want to acknowledge. You do not do things like that for nothing, I added, quieter now, but somehow more dangerous because of it. Because this was no longer about winning an argument. This was about understanding what just happened and why it felt so impossible to categorize. And for the first time since this started, Ethan did not respond immediately. He just stood there, looking at me, and the silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less like an audience waiting for a show, and more like something private, something suspended between just the two of us. A breeze moved through the courtyard, light, barely noticeable, but it broke the stillness just enough for the world to shift back into motion around us. Footsteps, voices, the distant hum of normal life continuing like nothing had changed, even though everything had, at least for me. You wanted proof, he finally said, and his voice was lower now, less detached, like he was choosing each word more carefully than before. You got it. And that should have been the end of it. That should have closed the loop, but it did not answer the question that was now sitting heavy in my chest, the one I was not sure I had the right to ask, but could not ignore anymore. I took another step, closer again, because apparently I had lost all sense of self-preservation at this point, and I held his gaze, refusing to let him deflect, refusing to let this dissolve into something easy and forgettable. Then why? I started, my voice catching for half a second before I pushed through it. Why did it not feel like you were just proving a point? And there it was, out in the open, the line I had just crossed, because now this was not just about what he did, it was about how it felt, and that was infinitely more complicated, infinitely more dangerous, and judging by the way his expression shifted, just slightly, just enough, I was not the only one who knew it. The moment the question left my mouth, I knew I could not take it back, and worse, I knew I did not want to, because whatever this was, whatever had shifted between us in the last 5 minutes, it had already crossed too many lines to pretend it was still simple, still harmless, still just another argument we would both walk away from like we always did. Ethan did not answer right away, and that alone was enough to confirm something was off, because Ethan always had an answer, always had a response lined up, sharp and precise and impossible to argue with. But now he was quiet, just looking at me like he was recalculating something that had suddenly become more complicated than expected. The space between us felt smaller again, even though neither of us had moved, like the air itself had tightened, and I could feel my own heartbeat in my throat, loud and insistent and deeply unhelpful. Because this was not supposed to matter, he was not supposed to matter. This was Ethan Blake, my rival, my constant source of irritation, the person I had spent years arguing with, competing against, refusing to give an inch to, and yet here I was, asking him why something felt real when it absolutely should not have. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it. I always saw the small things when it came to him, the almost invisible cracks in the perfect control he carried everywhere, and when his eyes came back to mine, something had shifted again, not gone, not broken, just different, like he had decided to stop pretending for half a second and did not quite know what to do with that choice. "You are overthinking it," he said finally, but the words did not land the way they were supposed to. They lacked the usual certainty, the clean edge that made his statements feel like facts instead of opinions, and I latched onto that immediately, because if there was one thing I knew how to do, it was push when he hesitated. "No," I replied, quieter now, but more certain than before, because I could feel it, that instinctive pull towards something I did not understand. And I was not about to let him dismiss it like it was nothing. "You do not get to decide that for me." And there it was again, that flicker, sharper this time, like I had stepped on something fragile that he had been trying very hard to keep hidden. For a second, I thought he was going to walk away anyway, that he would choose distance over whatever this was, that he would retreat back into the version of himself that never slipped, never hesitated, never let anything get personal. But he did not. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was. And that choice, that one small decision to not leave, felt bigger than anything he had said so far. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, and his voice was still controlled, still measured, but there was something underneath it now, something quieter, something that did not fit into the neat categories I had always assigned to him. And it caught me off guard, because I did not have a prepared answer for that. I did not know what I wanted him to say. I just knew that whatever he had already said was not enough. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Because for the first time since this started, I did not have a sharp comeback, did not have a sarcastic remark ready to go. And that left me standing there, exposed in a way I was not used to, in a way I did not like. "I do not know," I admitted, and the honesty of it felt strange on my tongue, unfamiliar and a little terrifying, because this was not how our interactions were supposed to go. This was not the script we followed, and yet here we were, completely off track with no clear way back. His expression shifted again, softer this time, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make my chest tighten, because that was new, that was something I had never seen from him before, and it made everything feel even more unstable, even more uncertain. "Then maybe it does not matter," he said, but this time it sounded less like a dismissal and more like a question, like he was testing the idea instead of stating it. And I shook my head immediately, because no, it did matter. It mattered more than I wanted it to, more than I was comfortable with, and I hated that. "It does," I said, and my voice was steady again, grounded in something I could not fully explain. "Because you do not do things halfway, Ethan, you never have." And that was the truth, the one thing I was absolutely sure about, the one thing that had remained consistent through years of rivalry and tension. He did not act without intention. He did not make impulsive moves just to prove a point. And if he did now, if this was the exception, then that meant something had changed, and I needed to know what it was. The silence that followed was heavier than before, less about the people around us and more about the space between us, about the question hanging there with no easy answer. And for the first time, I realized that whatever this was, whatever had started here, it was not something either of us could walk away from as easily as we had planned. The way he looked at me after that made it clear I had crossed into territory neither of us had mapped out. And for the first time since I had known Ethan Blake, he did not look like he had complete control over the situation, and that realization settled somewhere deep in my chest, heavy and unsettling and impossible to ignore, because if he was off balance, even slightly, then whatever this was had more weight than either of us had planned for. A group of people passed behind me, their laughter loud and normal and completely out of sync with the quiet tension wrapped tight around us, and it felt surreal, like the world had split into two layers, one where everything continued as usual, and one where time had slowed just enough for every small shift between us to feel amplified. I became aware, painfully aware, of how close we were again, not touching, but close enough that I could notice things I had never allowed myself to focus on before. The way his breathing had changed, slower but deeper, the slight tension in his shoulders like he was holding something back, and it made my thoughts spiral in directions I did not appreciate, directions that did not fit neatly into rivalry or annoyance or anything safe. "You are making this complicated," he said finally, and the words should have sounded like criticism, like a dismissal. But there was something quieter in his tone now, something that felt less like he was pushing me away and more like he was trying to steady himself. And that only made it worse, because I did not want to be the thing that made Ethan Blake unsure of anything. I did not want to matter in that way, and yet here I was, standing in front of him, refusing to let this go. It already is, I replied, and I meant it, because nothing about this felt simple anymore. Not the kiss, not the way he stayed instead of walking away, not the way I was still standing here. Instead of retreating back to the safety of sarcasm and distance, his jaw tightened slightly, just enough to notice, and I wondered, briefly and dangerously, what he was thinking, what calculations were running behind that controlled exterior, what part of this he was choosing to ignore and what part he could not. It was a mistake, he said, and there it was, the cleanest explanation, the easiest way to reduce everything back to something manageable, something dismissible, and I felt the immediate instinct to reject it, not because I had proof it was wrong, but because it did not match what I had felt in that moment, and I hated that my reaction was based on feeling instead of logic. I hated that I was relying on something so unreliable when it came to him. You do not make mistakes like that, I said, quieter now, because this was no longer about winning. It was about understanding, and I could hear it in my own voice, the shift from sharp to steady, from defensive to something more honest than I was comfortable with. He looked away then, just for a second, his gaze drifting past me like he was searching for something solid to anchor to, something that did not involve this conversation and that tiny break-in. Eye contact felt louder than anything else he had done so far, because Ethan did not look away, not when he was in control, not when he was certain. You think you know me, he said, and when his eyes came back to mine, there was something sharper there again, something defensive, but not in the way I expected, not cold or dismissive, more like guarded, like he was protecting something I had accidentally gotten too close to. I let out a quiet breath, because maybe I did. Maybe I knew parts of him better than I should after years of watching, competing, pushing against him, noticing patterns whether I wanted to or not. And that thought alone made everything feel more complicated than it already was. I know you do not do things without meaning them, I answered, and the certainty in my voice surprised even me, because that was the one thing I had always relied on when it came to him, his consistency, his control, his refusal to act without intention. And if that had changed, if this moment was proof that it could break, then that meant something bigger was happening beneath the surface. The silence stretched again, but this time it did not feel uncertain. It felt charged, like we were both waiting for the same thing, a truth neither of us had said out loud yet, something sitting just beneath the conversation, heavy and unavoidable, and I could feel it building, that quiet, dangerous shift from rivalry into something else entirely. Something I was not ready to name but could not ignore anymore. The tension did not break. It shifted, like something had quietly rearranged itself beneath the surface. And now every second that passed felt heavier, more deliberate, like we were both standing at the edge of something neither of us had planned to reach. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, not dismissive anymore, not entirely guarded either, just focused in a way that made it impossible to pretend this was still just an argument. And that realization made my stomach tighten, because I did not know how to handle this version of him. This version that did not fit into the neat categories I had relied on for years. A car passed on the street nearby, the low hum of its engine cutting through the silence just enough to remind me that the world was still moving, that people were still walking, talking, existing like nothing had shifted, and I almost envied that, the simplicity of not being caught in whatever this was. You are wrong, he said finally, and the words were quiet, not sharp, not dismissive, just steady, and that alone made them land differently, because Ethan Blake did not say things quietly unless they mattered, and my chest tightened again, because I knew, instinctively, that whatever came next was not going to be easy to ignore. I held his gaze, refusing to look away, because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that giving him space meant losing ground. And I was not sure what ground I was standing on anymore, but I was not ready to give it up. Then tell me, I said, and my voice was softer now, not challenging, not defensive, just open in a way I was not used to. And that alone made this feel even more dangerous, because openness with him had never been part of the equation. His jaw shifted slightly, like he was choosing his next move carefully, like every word mattered more than usual. And for a second I wondered if he would deflect again, if he would retreat back into the version of himself that never let anything slip. But he did not. Instead, he stepped closer, not enough to erase the distance completely, but enough to change it. Enough to make the space between us feel intentional again. My breath caught, just for a second, because apparently my body had decided to react before my brain could filter anything. And I hated that. I hated how aware I was of everything now. The proximity, the quiet, the way his presence felt heavier than it should have. "I do not make mistakes like that," he said, and this time the words did not sound like an excuse. They sounded like a statement, like something grounded and real, and that sent a sharp, confusing jolt through my chest, because that meant exactly what I had been trying not to consider. I swallowed, because suddenly my mouth felt dry, because suddenly this was not theoretical anymore. This was not something I could brush off or argue around. This was something real, something that had weight, and I did not know what to do with that. "Then what was it?" I asked, and my voice came out quieter than I intended, but I did not pull it back. I let it sit there between us, because I needed to know. I needed something solid to hold on to in the middle of this shift that was happening too fast for me to process. His gaze dropped again, just briefly, and this time I noticed the way his hand flexed slightly at his side, like he was resisting something, like there was a tension there that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what he was about to say. And that realization made my chest tighten even more, because I was not prepared for this. I was not prepared for him to be anything other than controlled and untouchable. "It was not just a point," he admitted, and the words were quiet, almost too quiet, like they were not meant for anyone else to hear. And for a second, everything else faded, the courtyard, the people, the noise, all of it, because those words changed everything. They shifted the foundation of what this had been, what we had been, and I felt it, that sudden, disorienting drop in my chest, like I had stepped into something deeper than I expected. I stared at him, because that was not enough. Because that answer only made more questions rise up, louder and more insistent than before, and I did not know if I was ready for any of them. But I could not stop now, not when we had already come this far. "Then what?" I asked again, barely above a whisper this time, because the space between us had turned into something fragile, something that felt like it could break if either of us pushed too hard. And yet I was still pushing, still reaching for something I could not fully define. His eyes lifted back to mine, and for the first time since I had known him, there was no distance there, no calculated detachment, just something direct and unfiltered that made my breath catch all over again, and I realized, too late, that whatever answer he gave next was not going to let me go back to the version of this that felt safe, because that version no longer existed. My chest tightened the moment his eyes locked onto mine like that, because whatever distance he used to keep between us was gone, completely gone, and it left something raw and unfamiliar in its place, something I did not know how to handle, something I was not ready to name, and yet I could not look away from it. For a second, he did not speak, and that silence stretched thin, fragile, like the air itself was waiting for him to decide how far he was willing to go. And I could feel it, the weight of that decision, pressing down on both of us in a way that made everything else fade into the background. My heart was still racing, uneven and loud, like it was trying to catch up to something my brain had not processed yet, and I hated how aware I was of it, how aware I was of him, of every small shift in his expression, every controlled breath that did not feel as controlled as it should have. "You already know," he said finally, and his voice was low, steady, but not distant, not detached, and that alone made my stomach drop, because no, I did not know. Or maybe I did and I just did not want to admit it, did not want to give it a shape that made it real. I shook my head immediately, because denial felt safer, easier, something I could still control. "No, I do not," I replied, and the words came out sharper than I intended, like I was trying to push him back into something familiar, something structured, where I could predict his next move. His gaze flickered, just for a second, like he was weighing something. Again, and then he took another step closer, closing the space between us in a way that felt deliberate, like he was done pretending there was distance left to maintain, and my breath caught again, because apparently that was my body's only response to him now, which was deeply inconvenient and entirely unacceptable. "You felt it," he said, quieter now, and there was no edge to it, no challenge, just a statement that landed somewhere deep and uncomfortable, because it was true, and we both knew it, and that was the part one could not argue with. I opened my mouth, ready to deny it anyway, ready to push back just to keep things from shifting any further. But nothing came out, because the words would have been a lie. And for some reason, I could not bring myself to lie to him in this moment. Not when everything else already felt so unstable. The silence that followed was different this time. Less tense, more aware, like we had both acknowledged something without fully saying it. And that made everything feel heavier, more real, more dangerous. That does not mean anything, I said finally, and my voice was quieter now, less certain. Because even as I said it, I could hear the weakness in it, the way it did not hold up under the weight of what had just happened, what was still happening. His expression shifted slightly, not amused, not dismissive, just knowing, and that made my chest tighten again, because I did not like being seen like this, not by him, not by anyone. It means something, he replied, and there was no hesitation in his voice now, no distance, just certainty, and it hit harder than anything else he had said so far, because it left no room for dismissal, no easy way out. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, because suddenly this felt too close, too intense, like I had stepped into something I could not control anymore, and that terrified me more than I wanted to admit. You cannot just decide that, I said, but the words felt weaker now, like I was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping through my fingers, and I knew he could hear it. I knew he could see it. And that made everything worse. He did not step back this time, did not give me space to recover. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, close enough that I could feel the shift in the air between us, the way it seemed to pull tighter with every second we stood there, and it made my thoughts scatter again, made it harder to focus on anything except the fact that this was real, that this was happening, and I had no idea how to stop it. I am not deciding anything, he said, and his voice softened just slightly, enough to make it feel less like an argument and more like something else entirely, something I was not ready to define. I am just not ignoring it, and that, more than anything, made my chest tighten, because ignoring things was what we did. It was how we survived this, how we kept everything contained and manageable, and now he was refusing to do that, and I did not know what that meant for either of us. I looked at him, really looked this time, searching for something familiar, something I could hold on to, but all I found was something new, something unguarded in a way I had never seen before, and it made everything feel unsteady, like the ground beneath us had shifted and neither of us knew where to step next. Then what happens now? I asked, and my voice was barely steady, because that was the question, the one I had been avoiding since the moment this started, the one that had no easy answer, and judging by the way his gaze held mine, steady and unyielding, I knew he was not going to let me pretend this was over either. The question hung between us, heavier than anything that had been said so far, because this was the part where things stopped being accidental and started becoming choices, and I could feel it, that quiet shift from something that happened to something that would keep happening if neither of us stepped back. And the worst part was I was not sure I wanted to step back anymore. Ethan did not answer right away, and this time it did not feel like hesitation. It felt like consideration, like he was weighing outcomes instead of searching for words, and that alone made my chest tighten, because he was taking this seriously, more seriously than I had ever seen him take anything involving me. The courtyard noise crept back in slowly, voices overlapping, footsteps passing, someone laughing too loudly in the distance, but it all felt distant, muted, like it belonged to a different version of reality where I was not standing here trying to figure out what came after something like this. That depends, he said finally, and his voice was steady again, but not cold, not detached, just grounded, like he had made a decision and was not entirely sure how I would react to it. And that realization sent a strange, nervous energy through me, because Ethan Blake did not second-guess reactions, he anticipated them, and if he was uncertain now, then this was as new to him as it was to me. I frowned slightly, because that was not an answer, not a real one, and I was already tired of half-answers, of statements that hinted at something without fully saying it. Depends on what? I asked, and my voice was quieter now, less defensive, because I could feel it, that pull again, the one that kept dragging this conversation deeper instead of letting it settle. His gaze held mine, unwavering, and there was something in it now that I could not Ignore, something direct and intentional that made it impossible to pretend this was still just about proving a point. On whether you are going to pretend this did not happen, he said, and the words landed harder than I expected, because they forced me to confront the one option I had been clinging to without fully admitting it, the idea that I could walk away from this, brush it off, file it under something meaningless and move on like nothing had changed. I let out a slow breath, because that option felt a lot less real now that he had said it out loud, a lot less convincing when he was standing right in front of me refusing to let it be that simple. And if I do, I said, even though the question felt weaker the moment it left my mouth, because I already knew the answer would not be what I wanted. His expression did not change much, but there was a subtle shift, something tightening just beneath the surface, like he did not like that possibility, but was prepared for it anyway. Then it stays what it was, he replied, and his voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it now, something sharper, something that felt like a boundary being drawn. A mistake, a moment, nothing more. And the words should have felt like relief. They should have given me an easy exit, a clean way to step back into something familiar, something safe. But instead they felt wrong, like they did not fit with what I had felt, what I was still feeling, and I hated that my reaction was so immediate, so instinctive. And if I do not? I asked, and this time my voice was steadier, more certain, because I needed to know, I needed to understand what I was stepping into before I made any kind of choice. His gaze sharpened slightly, not in a challenging way, but in a way that felt more focused, more deliberate, like he was fully present in this moment, like there was no part of him holding back anymore. Then we stopped pretending, he said, and the simplicity of it made my chest tighten, because there was nothing vague about that, nothing easy to misinterpret. It was clear, direct, and absolutely not something I could ignore. I stared at him, because those words carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because they implied something bigger than just this moment, something that reached back into years of tension, years of rivalry, years of things left unsaid, and suddenly all of that felt like it was shifting, like it was being redefined in real time. Pretending what? I asked, even though part of me already knew, even though part of me was just stalling, trying to slow this down before it moved too far ahead of me. His expression softened, just slightly, just enough to make my breath catch again, because that was new, that was something I had never seen directed at me before, and it made everything feel even more unstable. That this is just hate, he said quietly, and the words settled into the space between us like something final, something undeniable, and I felt it, that sharp, disorienting shift in my chest, like the ground beneath everything I thought I understood had just moved, leaving me standing in something unfamiliar and impossible to ignore. The words settled into me slower than they should have, like my brain was deliberately lagging behind just to avoid dealing with the full impact. Because pretending this was just hate had been easy. It had been convenient. It had given everything a structure I could rely on, something predictable and controlled. And now he was standing there, dismantling that structure like it had never been solid to begin with, and I did not know what to replace it with. I let out a breath that felt heavier than it should have, because suddenly everything felt heavier, the air, the silence, the space between us, all of it pressing in like I had stepped into something I could not step back out of. You are assuming a lot, I said, but the words lacked the bite they should have had, lacked the certainty I had built my entire dynamic with him on, and I knew he could hear it. I knew he could see it, and that made something twist uncomfortably in my chest. Ethan did not react immediately, but his gaze did not leave mine either, steady and unwavering in a way that made it impossible to hide behind anything shallow or deflective, and I hated that. I hated how easily he was pulling me into something real when all I wanted was to keep this at a distance where I could control it. Am I? He replied, and it was not a challenge, not quite, but it carried enough weight to make my thoughts stumble, because I did not have a clear answer, not one I was ready to say out loud. I crossed my arms instinctively, like that might rebuild some kind of barrier, some kind of separation between what I felt and what I was willing to admit, but it felt useless, thin and transparent compared to the way he was looking at me now, like he could see straight through it. We have spent years hating each other, I said, and the words came out more grounded than anything else I had said so far, because that part was true. That part was solid, something I could anchor myself to in the middle of everything shifting around me. You do not just change that in 5 minutes. And I held on to that, onto the logic of it, because logic felt safer than whatever this was turning into. His expression softened again, just slightly, and it made my chest tighten in a way I did not appreciate, because that softness did not belong here, not between us, not after everything we had been. I did not say it changed in 5 minutes, he said, and his voice was quieter now, more measured, like he was choosing his words carefully, not because he did not know what to say, but because he knew exactly what he was about to say mattered. I said we have been pretending, and that word landed differently, heavier than the rest, because it implied something ongoing, something that had been there long before this moment, something I had ignored or misread or simply refused to see. I shook my head immediately, because no, that did not make sense, that could not be right, because if it was, then that meant everything I thought I understood about us was incomplete, wrong, built on something I had not questioned deeply enough. That is not true, I said, but the certainty I was reaching for did not fully land. It hovered somewhere just out of reach, and I could feel it slipping, and I hated that more than anything else right now. Ethan exhaled quietly, not frustrated, not dismissive, just steady, like he had expected. This reaction, like he had already considered every way I might push back and decided to stand here anyway. Then why are you still here? He asked, and the question was simple, almost too simple, but it hit harder than anything else, because it stripped everything down to something undeniable, something I could not argue around or deflect from. And for a second, I had nothing, no immediate response, no sharp comeback, just that question sitting in my chest, heavy and impossible to ignore. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because the answer was there, somewhere just beneath the surface, but saying it out loud felt like crossing a line I could not uncross, and I was not sure I was ready for that, not yet. His gaze softened again, just slightly, like he had noticed the hesitation, like he understood exactly where my thoughts had stalled, and for the first time since this started, he did not push, did not press for an answer. He just stood there, waiting, giving me space in a way that felt deliberate and unfamiliar. The quiet stretch between us, not tense this time, not sharp, just open, like something was being offered instead of forced, and that made it harder, not easier, because now the choice felt like mine, and I did not know what to do with that. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, I saw something I had never allowed myself to see before, something beneath the rivalry, beneath the constant tension, something steady and real that had been there longer than I wanted to admit, and it made my chest tighten all over again. Because if that was true, if he was right, then this was not the beginning of something new. It was the moment I finally noticed something that had been there all along, and I did not know if that made it easier or infinitely more complicated. The silence stretched just long enough to make everything feel fragile, like whatever I said next could tilt this in one direction or another, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was not trying to win. I was not trying to outmaneuver him or land the sharper argument. I was just standing there, trying to figure out what was actually true beneath everything I had told myself for years. My arms slowly dropped from where they had been crossed, the movement small but noticeable, like my body had given up on pretending there was still a barrier between us. And I hated how exposed that made me feel, hated how aware I was of the way his gaze followed that movement, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that felt attentive, like he was paying attention to things I did not even realize I was revealing. I let out a quiet breath, because there was no clean way to step back now, no easy line I could throw out to reset everything to normal, because normal did not exist anymore, not after what had already been said, not after what he had admitted. I stayed because you kissed me, I said finally, and the honesty of it felt strange, heavier than anything else I had admitted so far, because it stripped away all the layers I usually hid behind, all the sarcasm and deflection, and left something simple and unguarded in its place, and I was not used to that, especially not with him. His expression shifted, just slightly, like he had expected something along those lines but was still processing the fact that I said it out loud, and that tiny reaction made my chest tighten again, because this was real, this was happening in a way neither of us could pretend away anymore. That is not enough, he said quietly, not dismissive, not invalidating, just honest, and I felt that land somewhere deeper than I wanted it to, because he was right. And that was the problem. That was the part one had been avoiding, because if that was not enough, then I had to look at everything else, everything underneath that had kept me standing here instead of walking away. I swallowed, because suddenly my throat felt tight, because suddenly this felt like stepping off something solid into something uncertain, and I did not know if I was ready for that. But I also knew I was already halfway there. Then I stayed because it did not feel like nothing. I said, slower this time, choosing the words more carefully, because this mattered now. This was not just a reaction. This was something I was trying to understand as I said it. And the moment the words left my mouth, I felt it. That shift, that quiet acknowledgement that I had just crossed another line. Ethan did not move, but something in his posture changed, something subtle, like he had been waiting for that, like he had needed to hear it said out loud to let himself believe it. And that realization made my chest tighten in a completely different way, because this was not just about me figuring things out. This was about him too, about whatever he had been holding back all this time. It never did, he said, and his voice was softer now, not guarded, not controlled in the same rigid way as before, just real. And that word settled into me with a weight I could not ignore, because it meant this was not new for him. This was not something that started 5 minutes ago. This was something that had been there, existing quietly beneath everything else while I dismissed it as rivalry, as irritation, as anything easier to handle than this. I looked at him, searching his face for something familiar, something I could still categorize, but all I found was that same steady presence, that same unfiltered focus that made it impossible to pretend this was anything less than what it was becoming. How long? I asked before I could stop myself, and the question felt dangerous the moment it left my mouth, because it reached back, because it implied history, because it meant this might not be a sudden shift, but something that had been building without my awareness. His gaze held mine, steady and unwavering. And for a second I thought he might deflect again, might pull back into something safer, but he did not. Instead he exhaled slowly, like he was letting go of something he had been holding on to for a long time. Long enough, he answered, and the lack of specifics somehow made it worse, made it heavier, because it left too much room for interpretation. Too many moments in the past suddenly recontextualized in a way I had never considered. My chest tightened, because that meant this was not just about now. This was about everything, about every argument, every look, every moment I had brushed off as something simple, something easy to define. And now all of it felt different, like I had been looking at the same picture from the wrong angle. This entire time, I let out a shaky breath, because suddenly this was bigger than I expected, bigger than I was ready for, and yet I was still standing here, still not walking away, and that realization hit harder than anything else, because it meant the choice I had been avoiding was already being made, moment by moment, with every second I stayed. The words lingered between us, heavy and irreversible, and I could feel the weight of them settling into something real, something that reached beyond this moment and into everything that came before it, reshaping it piece by piece in a way that made my chest feel too tight for a steady breath. Long enough, he had said, and that echoed in my head, looping over memories I had never questioned, small moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but now felt different, charged with something I had overlooked, something I had not been ready to see. I ran a hand through my hair, more to ground myself than anything else, because this was too much, too fast, and yet somehow also something that had been building slowly without my awareness, and I did not know how to reconcile those two things. You should have said something, I said, and my voice came out quieter than I expected, not accusing, not sharp, just confused, because if this had been there, if he had known, then why had he let it sit in the background of years of tension and rivalry without ever shifting it into something else? His gaze did not waver, but there was something in it now, something steadier, less guarded, like he had already accepted the answer to that question long before I asked it. You would not have listened, he replied, and there was no bitterness in it, no frustration, just a simple statement that landed harder than anything else, because it felt true in a way I could not deny. I opened my mouth to argue, to push back against that, but the words stalled before they could form, because he was right. because I had spent years interpreting everything between us through a single lens, one that left no room for anything softer, anything more complicated than competition and irritation. And realizing that now made something twist uncomfortably in my chest. "That does not mean you do not try," I said after a moment. But even as I spoke, I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice, the way it lacked the conviction I wanted it to have, because part of me understood why he had not said anything, understood how easily I would have dismissed it, turned it into something else, something easier to handle. Ethan exhaled quietly, and for a second, his gaze dropped, not in avoidance, but in something that felt more like acknowledgement, like he was letting that point exist without arguing it. "I did try," he said, and when his eyes lifted back to mine, there was something more open there, something I had not seen before, just not in a way you would recognize, and that made my chest tighten again, because suddenly there were too many moments to reconsider, too many interactions that might have meant more than I allowed them to mean at the time. I frowned slightly, trying to piece it together, trying to find something clear in the middle of all this uncertainty. "Like what?" I asked, and this time, there was no edge to it, no challenge, just a genuine need to understand. He hesitated, just briefly, and then his expression shifted into something almost thoughtful, like he was deciding how much to reveal, how far back to go. "Every time I did not push you away when I should have," he said, and the words were quiet, but they carried weight, because they implied something I had never considered, that staying, that engaging, that continuing this back and forth for years had not just been about rivalry, but about something else entirely, something that had kept him just as locked into this as I had been. I stared at him, because that changed things again, shifted the perspective in a way that made everything feel less one-sided, less accidental, and more intentional. And that was harder to process than anything else so far. "That is not exactly obvious," I said, but there was no real argument behind it, just an attempt to make sense of something that felt too layered, too complex to untangle all at once. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, just a faint acknowledgement. "It was not supposed to be," he replied, and that made something in my chest tighten again, because it meant he had been careful, deliberate in keeping this contained, in keeping it from becoming something that would disrupt everything we had built. And now here we were, past that point, standing in something neither of us had planned to reach. The air between us felt different again, less sharp, less confrontational, but no less intense, like the tension had shifted from conflict into something quieter, something that held just as much weight without the need for raised voices or sharp words. I let out a slow breath, because this was no longer about whether something had changed. It was about what we were going to do with it now, and that question felt bigger than anything else, heavier than any argument we had ever had, because this time there was no clear winner, no easy resolution, just two choices, one that kept everything the same, and one that changed everything completely, and for the first time, I was not sure which one I wanted more. The quiet settled between us in a way that felt final and unfinished at the same time, like we had reached the end of something and the beginning of something else without any clear lines separating the two. And I could feel it, that weight pressing in from all sides, asking for a decision I was not sure I was ready to make, but also knew I could not avoid forever. I looked at him, really looked this time, not as my rival, not as the person I had spent years pushing against, but as someone who had been standing in front of me this entire time with something I had refused to see. And that realization made my chest tighten in a way that was not entirely uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, like stepping into a space I had never allowed myself to enter before. "So what?" I said, my voice quieter now, not defensive, not sharp, just real. "We just stop pretending and everything changes overnight." And there was something almost ironic in that, because nothing about this felt sudden anymore. Nothing about it felt like it had just started. It felt like something that had been building quietly, steadily, until it finally reached a point where it could not stay hidden any longer. Ethan watched me, his gaze steady, and there was no hesitation in him now, no uncertainty, just that same grounded presence that made it impossible to ignore the direction this was heading. "Not overnight," he said, and his voice was calm, certain in a way that made my thoughts slow down just enough to follow it. "But we stop lying about what is already there." And that made something in my chest shift again, because it was not a demand, not a push, just an acknowledgement, a statement of something that existed whether I accepted it or not. I let out a breath, slow and uneven, because this was it. This was the moment where I either stepped forward or stepped back, and for the first time, stepping back felt wrong, like I would be ignoring something I had already started to understand, something I had already felt, even if I did not fully know what to do with it yet. And if I do not know what that is, I admitted, and the honesty of it felt heavier than anything else, because this was not about winning anymore. This was about admitting uncertainty, about standing in something undefined and not immediately trying to force it into something familiar. His expression softened again, just slightly, and this time I did not look away from it, did not try to dismiss it or categorize it as something else. I just let it exist, let it be part of this moment without pushing it away. Then we figure it out, he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because I had expected something more complicated, something more structured. But instead it was just that, a straightforward answer to something that felt anything but simple. I studied him for a second, because that sounded too easy, too open, and I was not used to that. Not with him, not with us, we. I repeated, and the word felt strange on my tongue, unfamiliar in the context of him and me being on the same side of anything. And yet it did not feel wrong, just new. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it carried weight, because it confirmed something I had not fully realized until now, that this was not just my decision, not just my shift to process. It was something shared, something that involved both of us moving forward instead of against each other. The noise of the courtyard seemed to return all at once, louder now, more present, like the world had been waiting for this moment to settle before continuing. And it felt strange, standing here in the middle of it all with something so quiet and significant unfolding between us, while everything else carried on like nothing had changed. I glanced around briefly, then back at him, because this felt too exposed, too open to exist in a space where anyone could see it, even if they did not understand it. And maybe he noticed that. Maybe he saw the way my shoulders shifted, the way my attention flickered outward for a second, because his gaze followed mine before returning to me. "Walk with me," he said, and it was not a command, not a demand, just an offer, something simple that carried more meaning than it should have, because it implied continuation, implied that this was not ending here, not dissolving back into something we could ignore. I hesitated for half a second, just enough to feel the weight of the choice, and then I nodded, because staying still felt impossible now, because walking away felt worse, and moving forward, even without knowing exactly where it would lead, felt like the only option that made sense. We fell into steps side by side, not touching, not close enough to draw attention, but close enough that I could feel the shift, the difference, the absence of the tension that had defined us for so long replaced with something quieter, something uncertain, but not unwelcome. And as we moved forward, I realized that for the first time, I was not thinking about how to win, or how to push back, or how to keep up with him. I was just there, walking next to him. And that alone felt like the biggest change of all, because whatever this was, whatever we were stepping into, it was not something either of us had planned, but it was something we were choosing now, together, one step at a time.